Episode 3 of HBO's The Undoing was titled Do Not Harm. Jonathan resurfaces as Grace learns about his recent troubles at work. Later, Grace facilitates an emotional reunion between Henry and his father as she finds herself being followed by someone close to Elena. Hey, what's going on, everybody, and welcome back to my channel, Movie Files. I am back again with my weekly recap, breakdown, and review of the latest episode of HBO's The Undoing. We're talking Episode 3, Do Not Harm. And it just seems like each episode has gotten better than the last. There are more Fraser family members that may be involved with this murder. And it's just so much to break down. I'm so excited to be here with you all tonight to talk about this episode in this spoiler discussion. Before we dive into the details, as you can see on the screen now, make sure you're following me on all my other social media accounts. That way you can stay up to date with what's going on over here at Movie Files. If you are new to the channel, welcome to the community. Make sure you subscribe, and while you're at it, hit that bell so you don't miss any of my other The Undoing reviews, other TV reviews, movie reviews, live streams, all the fun things we do on this very channel. It would mean the world to me if you all can give this video a thumbs up. It helps out the channel, but I also really appreciate it. And last but not least, let's discuss episode 3. I want to know your pros, your cons, but more importantly, I want to know your thoughts, your predictions, and your theories about the weeks ahead. This episode gave us a lot. I think there's a lot of misdirect going on here, whether it be with Grace, whether it be with Henry, whether it be with Franklin, or the husband himself. So much to go over, but I want to know what you all thought about it in the comments below. And by the end of this video, we're going to really break down our suspects and really break it all down. So really excited to get to that portion. But before we get to that point of the recap of my overall thoughts, let me give you just my initial thoughts of the episode. I thought it was fantastic. Again, I'm not surprised, but Nicole Kidman as Grace it's just been incredible to watch. Hugh Grant and his charm, his charisma, believing that he didn't do it, that as they say in this episode, he may be an asshole, but he's not a murderer. And then Henry starting to really do some stuff that's making me think he has something more than meets the eye. Same goes with Franklin. We'll talk about him. But just overall, guys, I thought the tension was there. The mysterious aspect is still very compelling and just really mysterious. And there's so much misdirect that's been thrown at us. There's a lot of symbolism in what Grace decides to wear, whether it be red or green. And just so many great things I'm loving about this episode and this season so far. But like I said, this episode was fantastic. And let's just jump right into this recap here, starting off with our opening scene. It picks up from last week's last shot as we see Grace has called the police. As we see before the police take Jonathan away, he tells Henry that he did not do it, and we see Henry shaking his head, agreeing to his dad's innocence. But what I found to be really interesting within this next kind of couple scenes here, and I think this first half of this episode really kind of points a light at Henry and his mindset. So after seeing his father being taken away by the police, the first thing he decides to do is go upstairs and play his violin. Now, if you guys remember from episode 1, him and his father had a little conversation, truly probably their last conversation before all this went down. Jonathan pokes fun at his son keeping up with his violin lesson. So by Henry going upstairs playing his violin, is that just kind of like him paying some type of respect to his dad? Like, you know what? My dad's going through all this, but I'm going to at least keep up with my studies, keep up with my practice with my violin? Or is there something a little bit more loose up there in his screws? As we see, his mother plays the piano with his dad during all this, and it seems like, again, this is a way of escaping the situation or maybe hiding something, and we'll talk more about hiding and Henry a little bit later. But I thought that was really interesting that the first thing he does after seeing, which I would imagine would be pretty traumatic, your dad being taken away by the police, and the first thing you do is play a violin. Very interesting thing for him to do, but no less, we see that the detectives are kind of pressing Grace at this point, as they've been doing these last few weeks. We see Detective Mendoza asks her, why did it take you so long to call the police? Can you tell us a little bit about the assault that your husband did to you? As she tells him that, he put his hands over his mouth and that stuff. And as Grace says, why do I get the feeling that you guys think I'm guilty, that I did this? And we'll talk about Grace a little bit later, especially with that last shot. But it's within this scene here that Detective Mendoza tells Grace the moment that we kind of suspected last week, as the results of that baby pregnancy test has come in. And the baby is no doubt Jonathan's. That baby girl is Jonathan. I don't think she has a name quite yet, or they've mentioned the baby's name, but it is a girl and it is Jonathan's child. So we all kind of suspected that, or at least I did from episode 1, but we now get that proof in the pudding. But interesting enough, within this scene, it just makes me kind of go back to episode 1 with Elena breastfeeding in front of Grace and the other mothers there, part of the meeting they had, and just the way she was looking at Grace, like, this is your husband. I don't know. It just makes that scene even more interesting when you kind of replay it. But again, just a really big moment that child is indeed Jonathan's. So as we move forward, we see Jonathan is being taken into prison. And then the next scene here is definitely something to keep an eye out for, guys, because we see Henry having breakfast with his grandfather, Franklin, who we'll definitely talk about in this episode. And he's watching the news, and the newscaster says that the murder weapon, which happens to be Elena's sculpting hammer, is missing. So, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in regards to that bag that Henry had. But we all know now, if we see some hammer at one of our main characters' houses, we can suspect them to be the murderer. So it's always just keep that in mind, that sculpting hammer is somewhere out there, and I wonder who has the possession of that. So I think it was pretty intentional that the show gave us a lot of Henry moments in the first half of this episode. As we see Henry go into his bedroom, he proceeds to throw his clothes on the ground out of frustration of finding out about his dad and all in the news. There's a murder weapon out there. We see him grab a bag. Now this bag, I couldn't really make out the full title of the bag, but it said something about an art museum. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, art museum, Elena was an artist. I might be reaching there, but we see him start to throw the stuff out of the bag. And there's like a bunch of random stuff, like a speaker, I think, a book, some notebooks, whatever the case may be. There was also some smaller bags within this bag. I don't know if one of those bags had a sculpting hammer in it. I don't know. But then he has a picture of his dad, and he looks at the picture of his dad. And again, I think this show did a really good job of misdirection. Now I'm thinking in my head, Henry may have something to do with this, man. He might have saw Elena having this affair with his dad. He doesn't want his family to break up. Out of passion, out of anger, he goes to the art place. Again, maybe they met at the art museum, and I don't know, and he went to her studio and killed her. Again, this show is doing a really good job of just making me theorize and coming up with all this stuff. But let me know what you all are thinking about Henry. Does he have more than meets the eye? Is there a mysterious murderer in this little boy? Let's discuss it in the comments below. We see Sylvia is being a good friend, or at least we think she is, suggesting to Grace that she hires an attorney because the chances of her being looked at as helping Jonathan is very high. We see Sylvia giving Grace the 411 of who's all representing who as we kind of go to the court trial. And interesting enough, within this scene, as Sylvia is kind of giving her the play call of who's there and all this stuff, and it's a mess, the media is there, she sees that Fernando is looking at her, and she tells Grace on the phone that, Fernando, the husband's looking at me like I did it, like I was the murderer. Again, another misdirect, because I know some of you all mentioned it last week that you think Sylvia may have something to do with it, which you may not be too far off, because as we see this scene plays out, we see Jonathan and Sylvia, they give each other a very interesting look a couple times, not just once. So when Jonathan's coming into the courtroom, they look at each other again. I know that they're friends. They have this history. He came to her to help him out with his case at work, blah, 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 blah. But those looks to me were a little bit more of like less of a friendly, like, hey, thank you for coming here type of look versus like, hey, how you doing type of look. Like, I don't know, maybe Sylvia and Jonathan had their own fling. Maybe Sylvia, out of jealousy of this new mother that's coming to the mix, is a little bit younger than her, that's, all this stuff, has his attention. I don't know. Maybe last week's theories from you all in the comments of Sylvia being involved. Again, man, this show is doing a good job of throwing curveballs, a monkey wrench to this equation. But I don't know. Let me know if you are one of those people that think Sylvia may have more to do with it. Let me know in the comments below, guys. So moving forward, we catch up with Jonathan. We see that he's been in prison for over a week now. He's having this meeting with his lawyer, played by Douglas Hodge, who I was not a big fan of his accent, but as I digress, he has this conversation with Jonathan, and the lawyer tells him that he actually prefers that his clients are guilty because it takes off pressure of him. But interestingly enough, we see that Jonathan wants to set up a meeting between himself and Grace, and we see that scene kind of plays out as the lawyer visits Grace, and they have a conversation. The lawyer tells him that, Jonathan wants Grace to vouch for his innocence, which we see Grace initially does not want to do that, but the lawyer tells him that Jonathan may be an asshole but not a killer. His gift is reading people, which we know that Grace kind of does the same thing with her profession. So very interesting enough that we see the pieces of the puzzle come together as we see Grace starting to really come to the idea of coming to Jonathan's side. So we get a quick and brief scene here between Franklin and his daughter Grace, as Grace is actually considering helping Jonathan prove his innocence. But I find it very interesting that all the scenes that we've gotten with Franklin so far as the father of Grace have been 2 or 3 minutes tops, really quick dialogue, and I think it's intentional. And we'll talk about Franklin and that $500,000 a little bit later, but I think the show was intentionally giving us very small little nuggets of this character, because I think there's definitely more than meets the eye than Franklin, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. But let me know if you guys are kind of like me me is there's a reason why we only get brief scenes with this character. Let's talk about it in the comments. So definitely something that's a small detail, but something you guys have mentioned in the first episode in regards to Grace's wardrobe, whether she's wearing red or wearing green. Now, as we all may or may not know, when we see red, it kind of symbolizes blood, and historically it's associated with danger, right? And then we see Grace wearing green, especially when she's going to go visit Jonathan at the prison. Now, green represents rebirth, renewal, as well as hope. So again, small little detail, but I think the details are in the devil's in the details, as it says. So I think it's always important to recognize when she's wearing red and where she's wearing green. Like I said, with her wearing green, she has hope for Jonathan, but when she's wearing red later on in scenes, we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So yet another stroke of brilliant acting by Nicole Kidman as she visits Jonathan at the prison. We see her eyes are red after crying. She confronts him about his daughter. And again, I just think Nicole Kidman has been so great in the show. We all know she's a fantastic actress, but she's doing a great job of lying on the fence, guys. Like, we see that she seems to be so surprised by all these news. Her husband might be a murderer. Her husband, has another child out there, had an affair. But then we have these other moments, right, of her talking to herself, having these dream-like sequences, and then we'll talk about the ending as well. And I think my theory, like I had mentioned in the comments last week, of her having these blackouts and maybe having this disorder where she kind of doesn't know what she's doing, which plays into the intro of this show, this kind of dream-like sequence. But I think Nicole Kidman is so great in this show. And again, within this scene, as we see Jonathan kind of trying to convince her that he needs to see his son one last time to kind of convince his son to get on his side. I just thought, again, don't get me wrong, Hugh Grant was great in that moment, but I just had to point out the brilliance of the acting from Nicole Kidman. So we get the return of Stuart that we met last week as he agrees to meet with Grace. He goes on to talk about the relationship between Elena and Jonathan and that they didn't try to hide it, right? He goes into more detail about his true feelings of Jonathan and that Jonathan has like this God complex and he has this big ego. And I'm thinking to myself, here is another example of the show giving us a misdirect because it's making it seem like Stuart had some jealousy towards Jonathan, right? Now, I don't know if his jealousy would lead to him killing someone, but they're definitely, again, this is a show is like, okay, what about this person? Okay, what about that person? Again, at the end of the day, we have 3 episodes left. It could be that Jonathan is the murderer, but I love how the show, again, is just throwing all these curveballs at us and making it, like I said, Stuart's like, oh, he's this God complex. He would pretend to care about his patients, but I thought that was really interesting that Stuart said all that. I mean, there may be some truth to that, but again, do we need to keep an eye on Stuart now because he might be a suspect? Let me know what you all thought about that scene in the comments below. So yet another scene, and I really appreciated the scenes that we got with Grace and her father this week as she's telling her dad about the hero worship, how some people worship doctors, policemen, firemen, and, Grace goes on, she's trying to convince herself that maybe Elena had this type of complex or had this type of relationship with Jonathan, him saving her son, so she fell in love with him and ultimately slept with him and had a baby with him. But I'm thinking in my head, well, Grace, maybe this is the pot calling it black because maybe you suffer from this complex, right? I don't know if Jonathan saved her at some point in her life or that she just worships him because we've seen in these 3 episodes, she kind of revisits the moments that Jonathan had with his clients, or I should say his patients. And again, maybe she worshipped him, right? And maybe she saw him more than what he was as a doctor. So again, I just love the details that the show has and kind of alluding to us believing Grace and her belief of pointing the finger at someone else, but all at the end of the day, she may be pointing it at herself. So really, really, really big moment here, guys, because we see Franklin reveals to Grace that he gave money to Jonathan because Jonathan came to him and lied about not having enough money. They need to have money for Henry's school. And we find out that this is a large sum of money. We find out that Franklin gives Jonathan $500,000, even though we know that Henry's school is only $50,000, but he gives him $500,000. That's a lot of money. So bear with me. Again, I mentioned that there's a lot of suspects in this mixed bowl here. So the Franklin theory. So I am to theorize. Let's just play with me here. Franklin gives Jonathan the money. Jonathan knows that's a large sum of money. So he has people following, Jonathan to see if he's a man of his word, if he's going to use his money towards his family or if he's up to no good. And he finds out that Jonathan's having this affair. I don't know. The private investigator is also a hitman, maybe. I don't know. Follow with me. He in a way of like showing like, you know what, you better give me my money back or else I'm going to harm someone that's close to you, not my family, but someone closer to you, aka Elena. Things got out of hand and that person that Franklin hired killed Elena? I don't know. Or Franklin himself did it? I don't know. Let me know what you all thought about, number one, $500,000. Why did he give him so much money? And then let me know if you guys think that Franklin might have had something to do with Elena's death, a la he hired someone to follow Jonathan. They found out what he was doing, and in return of his betrayal to his family, he had Elena killed. It was an accident. He did it himself. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because this is more interesting here. As we see, as the scene kind of plays out, he's crying in front of Grace. He apologizes for not telling her the truth. We see that he clears his head at his own balcony, and then he goes to pay a visit to Fernando, Elena's husband, as he's watching him through the window. So again, was there some type of arrangement with Fernando and Franklin? Is Franklin keeping an eye on this child as leverage? Let me know what you all are thinking about Franklin being a suspect of this murder. So we see that Grace ultimately does take Jonathan to go visit his dad, Jonathan. We see Jonathan tries to make some small talk with Henry, but Henry goes straight for the jugular as he asks his dad, did you kill her? As we see, Jonathan, of course, says no, but Henry comes right back at him and says, well, you had sex with her, right? So I think, again, this is not necessarily, I think Henry knows that his father didn't kill Elena, but I think, again, going back to my Henry maybe having something involvement with it, him just wanting to know why his dad wants to break up this family. We see Jonathan does admit that he did make a mistake in sleeping with this client. He felt bad for her. He felt bad for her situation. And we see him continuously say that Elena was obsessive and she became threatening. So again, it's him, this poor woman's face was bashed in, but he's continuing to bash her character, which we'll talk about with Fernando said a little bit later in the episode. But again, really interesting moment that Grace did decide to take Henry to go see her dad and everything, him admitting to his mistakes. But let me know what you all thought about this particular scene here. So yet another scene between Grace and Franklin, as Grace is trying to convince Franklin that Jonathan is not a monster and that she would like help from her father in hiring a lawyer. And this is where we find out about Haley Fitzgerald, as she wants her to defend Jonathan in trial. And this was interesting here. We hear for the first time, at least this is the first time I can recollect, that as Franklin agrees to have Fitzgerald give Grace the information about Fitzgerald, the lawyer, they're playing the piano. And then as they're playing the piano, they mention, I should say, Grace mentions her mother. It reminds her of her mother. We don't know what happened to her mother. I assume she's dead, but how did she die is the question, right? Was there some type of infidelity and Franklin had something to do with her death? I don't know. I'm just like all over the place with these theories tonight, right? But I thought it was interesting that we hear for the first time about her mother, and I'm wondering if her mother has some type of not disability, but disorder about blackouts or sinister or dark past. Something to keep an eye out for is the identity and what was the relationship like between Grace and her mother. So as we kind of wrap up the episode, we see Jonathan gets into a prison fight. We see he bites the inmate's finger and shows the blood of the aftermath. Again, this is the show letting the audience know that Jonathan does indeed have a dark side as he bites this man's finger. I mean, to his defense, he was trying to, help himself out and not get his ass beat in prison. But again, I think this was interesting that he showed that splat of blood, again, showing us the darker side of Jonathan. As we move forward, we see Grace goes to meet Fitzgerald. And in this conversation, you notice that Elena's husband is actually following her there. But as Grace talks to Fitzgerald, we see that she's wearing blue, which symbolizes inspiration and some hope, as we saw earlier with her wearing green. And we see that the lawyer agrees to represent Jonathan, but she's going to stir up some issues with this trial. So it'll be really interesting to see how good she is as a lawyer and if she's able to convince the jury if Jonathan is indeed innocent. We see that Detective Mendoza pays Franklin a visit as he believes that Grace is hiding something, which we'll obviously talk about at the end of this episode. Franklin politely tells him that if he wants to question him more, he better have a warrant. As we kind of move forward, we see Fernando confronts Grace and they have a conversation. And this was a very interesting conversation as we see, they have like this battle of words as, Fernando says, well, what kind of doctor was your husband? And then, Grace says, well, what kind of wife, what kind of patient, sleeps with the doctor that saved her son? So very interesting battle of words there. But interesting enough, we see again that kind of pushback, or may I say darker side of Grace, as she says, Fernando, are you threatening me? Because I had enough of people's shit, right? She's stepping up for herself as we saw her do last week. But interesting enough, we see that, she asks Fernando, did Elena have secrets? Did she have some type of, disorder where she had this impulsive type of obsessive personality? And he says, you better watch out, right? So again, the show, throws in the mix, does Fernando have something to do with it, right? But I really loved how Grace, again, the show is showing us the different sides of these characters. We saw Jonathan biting someone's finger. We see Grace kind of being a little standoffish and being really kind of, argumentative in front of Fernando. So we're seeing these different sides of these characters, which again just makes it really interesting and some really good character development. So yet again, we see Grace has a dreamlike sequence as she's imagining Fernando catching Elena in the act of having an affair. Again, is this her imagining this, or is this her actually seeing what happened? Because as we know, as we wrap up this review, Grace has some secrets of her own. So we wrap up the episode with Grace visiting the two detectives about Fernando, following her and having the conversation that they had, and that she suspects that he should be an actual suspect in this murder case. She presses them about the security footage. They initially don't want to give her information, but she presses hard enough, and then they end up showing her what she might not have wanted to see. As we kind of move forward and wrap up the episode, we see Mendoza pulls out his laptop, shows some footage from a block away, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, that footage is the person that was at the crime scene the time that Elena was murdered, and that person was Grace. So we hear her talking to herself, which we see her do that last week of her having these inner conversations with herself, but she's like, oh, I was out for a walk, but why haven't you told anyone about this walk, Grace? So again, the show throws another curveball at us. Again, on my list, and again, let me know in the comments you guys as prime suspects. Right now, Grace is my number one. And the reasons behind that is because, again, I think that she has these type of, not only these dreamlike sequences that we see of her imagining someone else in certain positions, that I think it's actually her viewing these things, but also I think she has this type of, again, we'll learn maybe more about her mother, and maybe her mother has this type of genetic where she has this blackout moments, and she might not remember brutally killing Elena after figuring out that she was having an affair with her husband. So right now, Nicole Kidman, I love you. You're great in this show, but I think you're our prime suspect as the murderer. I think number two for me right now is Henry. He's a kid. I think, again, my whole theory of him being so upset that his family's breaking up that he uses rage and unfortunately killed Elena might be a far-fetched, but he's my number two. Then number three comes in at Franklin for me, about the whole $500,000, hired a hitman or a private investigator to look, what was Henry or Jonathan up to, and he found out what it was, and then things just got out of hand, and then that hitman or maybe Franklin himself killed Elena. So that's my third suspect. And then as far as other people, Sylvia is a wild card because, again, did she have an affair with Jonathan? Was there jealousy on her end? Who knows? And then, of course, I guess the prime suspect is Jonathan. I don't think he did it, man. I really don't think, even though we get the dark moment of him biting someone's finger and seeing his dark side, I don't think it's too easy. I don't think it's Jonathan. And again, I guess we could say Fernando, but I don't think he's involved as well. So that's just my thoughts, guys. Let me know who your prime suspects are. Let me know your pros and cons of this episode. And of course, let me know your theories for episode 4 in the weeks ahead. So I have such a great time covering this show, breaking it down every week with you all and interacting with you all in the comments. So let's continue the conversation in the comments below. As always, make sure you like this video, share this video, leave your thoughts on the episode below. As always, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of my other reviews for this show, other shows I cover, movies I cover, as well as live streams I do on this channel. Hope you all enjoyed this review. Hope you're staying safe, and we'll see you all on the next video.